Welcome. My name is Johannes von Moltke. I'm the acting director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at the University of Michigan. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all to what is our last noon lecture, at least noon in Michigan, for the semester with Balint Magyar, who I'm really delighted to be able to welcome, though he is in Budapest, to welcome to the screen in Michigan and elsewhere. We're also thrilled by the interest that clearly this event, which we scheduled fairly recently, elicited. We had a lot of people express interest, and I have a feeling that those of us in the United States have a lot to learn, and I look forward to learning about about attempts to overthrow liberal democracy as we see our voting rights being attacked here. Balint Magyar is a research fellow at the Central European University in Vienna and Budapest. He himself is in Budapest at the Democracy Institute, where since 2020 he has been working. He has a degree, a doctoral degree in political economy from Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest, and has published and edited numerous books on post-communist mafia states since 2013. And I'll mention in particular a recent volume that appeared with CEU Press entitled Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes, which he co-wrote with Balint Madlovich. And we'll put a link to that. The book is accompanied by a website, which is in turn accompanied by teaching materials. So sounds like a really, really useful resource, and we'll put that in the chat for you to follow up on. Balint Magyar was an Open Society Fellow carrying out comparative studies in this field of post-communist states in 2015-16, was Hans Speyer visiting professor at the New School in 2017, a senior fellow at the CEU Institute for Advanced Study in 2018-19, and a research fellow at the Financial Research Institute from 2010 to 2020. He has a history as an activist of the Hungarian anti-communist dissident movement, was himself a founder of the Liberal Party of Hungary, the SZDSZ, in 1988, and served as a member of Hungarian parliament for 20 years, during which he had 2 stints as the Minister of Education. We feel very privileged, Balint Magyar, to have you here with this breadth of experience and knowledge that you're able to share with us, and I very much look forward to your talk, and we'll pass the proverbial mic across the Atlantic to Budapest.
Thank you very much. The pleasure is mine that I have the opportunity to share with you my views. The title of my presentation here now is about Poland and Hungary, 2 autocratic attempts to overthrow liberal democracy. These systems, these countries used to be mentioned together, and at the same time, in the wide public, they are considered similar systems. Of course, it has some base for such judgments, because if we look at those ideological panels, what they use, there are a huge similarity. For example, both governments define themselves as representatives of new regime change, because according to them, the old regime change of the 1890s and 90s was practically stolen by elites who made bad compromises, the old elite and the new elite, and therefore after that compromise, which was a kind of compromise between above the heads of the bargain above the heads of the people of the societies, they declare the necessity of a new regime change. As a result of this new regime change, they declare themselves the real representatives of the nation. and they try to expropriate the notion of the nation, which should belong only to such people who share the same ideology with themselves, and it is accompanied, of course, with a kind of ethno-nationalism. At the same time, this is accompanied by a Euro-skepticism, and they all the time fight against Brussels dictatorship on the basis of a historical grievance. But it does not disturb them to use the resources of the EU to speed up their economic growth. These ideological panels, what they used, is accompanied with some direct elements of homophobia, xenophobia, nationalism, and they use these ideological panels to create a kind of fear and suspicion towards refugees, and practically such people who cannot be incorporated in their model, what they think about the nation should be. But altogether, if we see that there are a lot of similarities between these ideological frames, what they use, Hungary and Poland, we have to see that these are different types of autocratic regimes. The question is that what is the real difference between these regimes? Just summarizing at the beginning, I would say that Poland has a conservative autocratic model for this regime, what they try to create, and the Hungarian government has a model of a post-communist mafia state. And now I would like to list the basic differences between these two regimes. Poland is more or less motivated by power and ideology. They are ideology-driven regimes. To some extent, I would say that fanatic and emotional. And when I say that they are ideological-driven, it means that following a certain coherent ideology, they are ready to pay the price of it. Or if some elements or some panels of this ideological set is not popular among the population. The Hungarian regime is not motivated by power and ideology, it's motivated by power and personal wealth, the enrichment of the adopted political family. I will speak about it later. And contrary to Poland, the Polish system, which is an ideology-driven regime, it's an ideology-applying regime. To some extent, it's a cynic regime using different ideological panels, which means that if I'm speaking about that it's an ideology-applying regime, it means that it has not ideological coherence, the used ideological panels, what they use, but it has a functionality coherence. We could use a term which was used already for the description of the Sicilian mafia, that they follow a kind of amoral familism. Amoral familism means that they feel only responsibility towards those people who are declared to belong to that adopted political family. The next difference between the two regimes, that the actual decision-making in Poland remains more centered within the framework of formal institutions, which means that the formal body of leadership is the PiS, the Polish governing party, and the leadership of the PiS. Of course, this party is a centralized party, the ruling party is a centralized party, but anybody who has real political power, they have severe positions within the party itself. In Hungary, the situation is not like this. The political economic decision-making is removed from the legally defined formalized organizations, and so removed from from the social control, and they create a kind of informal body of leadership. At the top of this leadership is the so-called chief patron's court. This is the name, I would say, use the leadership's name. And at the top is the chief patron. Chief patron, I would say, if I use the metaphor post-communist mafia state, the godfather. And this chief patron's court is consisted of people having formal and informal positions at the same time. The party, the ruling party, the Fidesz in Hungary, has no real power. They are a transmission-led party. Such an organization, like, let us say, the trade unions were during the communist times in whole Eastern Europe, in that system, where the real decision-making body was the Communist Party, and other organizations, like the trade unions, were transmission-bad organizations that's transmitting the will of the Communist Party. Now, in Hungary, the Fidesz has no real power. Even formally, it's we can see that in the last 5-6 years, the Fidesz as a party even does not has a party program, what they would represent in their governance, or to use it in their campaigns in the elections. Only the chief patron, Viktor Orbán, has a so-called program. So the real decision making was taken out from the formal institutions, and it's in the informal body of the chief patron's court. Further differences is that in Poland, it's a state-diriged bureaucratic control, what they try to spread over the society. While in Hungary, it's a single pyramid patronal network, which was formed when the Fidesz could gain a monopoly of political power, with the help of a very disproportionate election system that in 2010, with 53% of the votes, they gained 67% of the seats, and in such a way they could unilaterally change the constitution and bring any other laws by themselves only, without any compromises or negotiations with opposition parties. But while in Poland, this system tried to spread the state control over the economy, over the media and other parts, but at the same time, more or less respects the free market competition and the freedom of enterprises. Contrary to this, in Hungary, we can witness a centralized chain of command building a patron-client networks of vassalage. And in such a way, while in Poland, we can witness a party political nepotism. So if they want to enter into different spheres of the society, they make it through the state and nationalizations and state property. On the other hand, and the ruling elite practically is centered around the party elite. In Hungary, the ruling elite has the form of an adopted political family. This is a clan type of organization. Adopted political family, which means that you can be adopted to this leading group or fired if you are not loyal. Therefore, of course, when there is a party political nepotism in Poland, this is a kind of favoritism, but more or less combating corruption. In Hungary, the post-communist mafia state centralizes and monopolizes corruption. This is a very important thing, that the mafia state, like classic mafia, fights only against the unauthorized corruption, against such corruption which is not directed and centralized by themselves. So therefore, we could say that while in Poland, the loyal elite is mainly rewarded with offices but not wealth. In Hungary, the adopted political family accumulates wealth through the bloodless instruments of state coercion, rent-seeking and centrally led corporate trading, which is going on, practically blackmailing private enterprises and take over the property even from Hungarian owners. While the Polish one is just an attempt, but not a finished attempt, not a completed attempt to create an authoritarian state. In Hungary, we witness the creation of a criminal state, which commits practically crimes, corruption crimes and other crimes, but as having a two-thirds majority, a constitutional majority in the parliament, there are no independent chief attorney's office or independent jurisdiction that they could hamper this process. So the criminal state, the mafia state, what is created in Hungary, is a privatized form of a parasite state. If we try to compare the international preferences of the two autocratic attempts, we see that in Poland's, in Kaczynski's Poland, they try positioning Poland as it is, while in its foreign policy, Viktor Orban tries to position himself. They had always an ambivalent, Poland has always an ambivalent relationship with Germany, and they fought against it, against Russians and Germans at the same time, and we see among the peace members such a relationship towards Germany. Until now, in the case of Orban and the Fidesz, they were not fighting Germany. He was fighting mainly Angela Merkel and Manfred Weber. But now it's a change now in policy that they leave after leaving the European People's Party. They try to attack Germany in this sense as well. Poland is directly and honestly committed to the Atlantic Alliance, while in the last 10 years in Hungary, Orban practically dismissed all politicians and diplomats who were in favor to the Atlantic Alliance, and changed for such loyal guys who were ready to serve his program of Eastern opening, which meant that he wanted to create and even created very strong relations with Russia, China, Turkey, Central Asian autocratic regimes as well. And I would say ironically that he, as a member of the Turk alliance and association of Turk countries, which consists of only autocratic regimes, it's a kind of autocrats international. On the other hand, Poland has a very strong anti-Russian feeling and policy, and even try to support Ukraine and Georgia in their fight against Russian dominancy. In such a way, while opposing Brussels policy, Kaczynski is motivated by repositioning Poland's status within the EU and to have better in the so-called independent position for Poland within the EU, but it's never a question whether they would leave the EU as well. Orban was tried to build out a blackmailing position against Brussels and against the EU, and with the with the renewal of the Visegrad 4 countries cooperation, he tried to create a blackmailing alliance against the so-called Brussels dictatorship. in both countries, you will find the slogan of Europe of Nations, and they fight so-called for an autonomous status. But in the case of Orban, it means that practically, I would say that a criminal organization wants to create a kind of impunity for itself within the EU. They would like to take as much from the EU funds as it's possible, and we are pioneers on this way. So in a per capita calculation, we drew the most funds from the common EU funds for Hungary, but on the other hand, they fight very much against any control of how they would spend this money, what they get from the EU. At the same time, it means that if these problems within the EU cannot be solved, then maybe we will have to witness such a situation where in the future a multi-speed EU will be unavoidable, and some signs, let us say the creation of the euro and the countries around the euro, which and some attempts to have a closer, more federalistic cooperation among EU countries can create a multi-speed EU, which can create a marginalization for Hungary. But let's see that what are the constraints of the autocratic attempts in these countries. I have to say that Poland is still far from the point of no return, while Hungary is close to the point of no return. In Poland, you have a proportionate election system and the divided executive power, which can help to create a balance between the government and the opposition forces within the society. In Hungary, Orban had to gain once a big victory, and with the 53% of the votes to have 67% of the seats in the parliament, the constitutional majority there. And as a result of this, they immediately manipulated and changed election laws, etc. And in 2014, already it was enough to reach 44% of the votes to have a two-thirds majority of the seats. And in 2018, they reached 48% of the votes, and they had also two-thirds majority within the parliament because of this disproportionate election system, which meant that they could go through autocratic breakthrough. They could create an autocratic breakthrough in Hungary, while in Poland this autocratic breakthrough could not happen yet. This is, as I mentioned already in the case of Poland, it was the result of the divided executive power, that the directly elected president has a relatively strong presidential legitimacy. And in spite of the fact that the president still belongs to the PiS, he's what I say more autonomous than the Hungarian president, Mr. Rade. We do not have a divided executive power. The president of the country is indirectly elected by the parliament. It is a two-thirds majority of the parliament, so it has a weak presidential legitimacy. And there are different social traditions of resistance to monopolize the power in Poland, while in Hungary, after the defeat of the '56 revolution and the retortions following the revolution, well, a new style of relation toward the power emerged. This is much more to have individual bargains with the regime who are in power. So at the same time, you can see that in Poland there is a political diversity as the municipal government, in the municipal governments, there is a strong opposition presence there, while in Hungary in 2019 it changed, but with the two-thirds majority within the parliament, the Fidesz practically overrode the election results and deprived the local governments from a lot of rights which belong to it. In Poland, still exists an independent media platform, a very strong one, in spite of the fact that the Polish state-owned company could buy from the German owners a lot of regional dailies, TV stations, and websites. But it's still the media is much more independent than in Hungary, where we do not have the traditional censorship what we could witness in this communist times, only in the state-owned media, but they do not try to control the content, much more the access, and such a way practically there is a more narrow and narrow possibility space for the opposition forces to express widely their opinion. Mainly the social media remained the most important terrain for that. Now, if we compare these things, then I would show you that in that book, what we wrote together with my young colleague Balint Modlovich, we created the difference not only on a scale of democracy and dictatorship, which is used in the mainstream politology, but we doubled practically these categories. And in democracy, we distinguish two types of democracies: liberal democracy, I don't have to say what it is, but patronal democracy. This means that in a patronal democracy, there are patron-client networks fighting each other, and none of them has a monopoly of political power. Conservative autocracy and patronal autocracy, the difference is that in a conservative autocracy, only the political institutions are invaded by one single political actor, but on the other hand, the rest of the society is more or less independent, the economy and the civic sector. In a patronal autocracy, Hungary, Russia, Central Asian republics, it's not the case. In a patronal autocracy, there is a single pyramid patronal network, which practically abolishes all other competing patronal networks and create a monopolistic position there, and creates patron-client relations practically in all spheres of social actions, political sphere, economic, and the social sphere. While in communist dictatorship, we try to make difference between traditional communist dictatorships like North Korea and market exploiting dictatorship like China and Vietnam, where under strong control, but there emerged a real market economy, but the Communist Party still retained his monopolistic power. And if we try to modeling what happened after the regime change in the post-communist world, then we see as primary trajectories four different model of changes, and this is a very useful and great possibility to compare these countries, as all of them until the years of 89-90, they were communist regimes which were characterized by a one-party system and the dominance of the state-owned economy. And practically the starting point, not considering, which is very important, the historic background, but the former starting point was the same during this regime change. And there are four different trajectories in this. One is when from a communist dictatorship, liberal democracy is created, which means that on the level of the political institutions, you will see a change that from communist dictatorship there will be a liberal democracy, and on the other level, you see that a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network, which was the nomenclature and the communist power, now it's a multi-pyramid non-patronal network. What happens? Now the next type of regime change is the B1, when one from a communist system, a patronal democracy emerges directly. This was the case in Romania and Ukraine, when a communist dictatorship was replaced by a patronal democracy, which meant that a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network was replaced by the multi-pyramid informal patronal networks, which are the so-called political parties, where the political parties they are just the cover of fighting patronal networks with each other. The third type of this primary trajectory is when, from a communist dictatorship, created directly, more or less directly, a patronal autocracy, which means that from communist dictatorship, a patronal autocracy on the political level, on this patronal level, it means that single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network is transformed into a single pyramid informal patronal network. These are the so-called, what I call in post-communist regimes, post-communist mafia state. And when we are, and the last one is like, which is not a regime change, a real regime, which is the case of China, when from a communist dictatorship, a market exploiting dictatorship is emerged from a single pyramid patronal network, single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network, and other single pyramid bureaucratic patronal network rules that. It's much more a model change. When we are speaking about patronalism, and what is the difference between bureaucratic networks and patronal networks, I would say that it has four dimensions. One is when formal institutions are replaced by informal institutions. When normative regulations are replaced by discretional regulations, when the collective decision-making is practically for a personal one, and when the bureaucratic dependency structure is replaced by patron-client dependency structure. But these, what we could see here, these are only the primary trajectories. This is not a final station for most of these countries. So we can see secondary trajectories in these communist regimes. And now here we can see the difference between Poland and Hungary as well. That, for example, from a liberal democracy, you start to go towards a conservative autocracy. It's not finished yet, this step in the case of Poland, when a multi-pyramid non-patronal network is tried to be transformed into a single pyramid non-patronal network, but it's still a non-patronal network, which means yet that there are no created patron-client relations within the economy in the case of the Polish autocratic attempt. While the leader of Poland, Kaczynski, is not that type who would run for increasing personal wealth, and the whole system is not working around that. The second model change, where the Czech Republic started to go in the last years, when from a liberal democracy, it started to be transformed into a patronal democracy. The whole Babiš government is practically like that, when a chief oligarch becomes the political leader and creates personal businesses for himself and his clients, but it's still a multi-pyramid system what is the difference? That it's going from a direction of a multi-pyramid non-patronal system towards a multi-pyramid informal patronal system. In Hungary, it's a regime change already, where from a liberal democracy, it is created where we had a multi-pyramid non-patronal system. A patronal autocracy is a single pyramid informal patronal system. And the last one is Russia, of course, went from, which was never a liberal democracy, it was a patronal democracy. And from a patronal democracy, it was transformed into a patronal autocracy, which means that multi-pyramid informal patronal networks were replaced by practically single pyramid informal patronal networks. Now I tried to use this. This shows now this chart, the Hungarian trajectory as it went in time, and the next one shows the Polish way. We see that is different. But now let me to try to change for the other yes, one moment, I have to, yes, share, one moment, yes. This is now what I have, it's a 3D dimension, which means that most of the namings of these countries, post-communist countries, that illiberal democracies, hybrid regimes, etc., they use a lot of words for it. They try to use one characteristic, one segment of the description. Now, in this triangle model, what you see, we made a difference among these three, among 6 types of regimes, what I mentioned before, communist dictatorship, liberal democracy, patronal autocracy, and intermediary regimes as conservative autocracy or bureaucratic autocracy, patronal democracy, and market exploiting dictatorship. But of course, if there are different dimensions of it, then we can see that according to the classic divisions, liberal democracy, electoral democracy, competitive and authoritarian regimes, hegemonic authoritarian regimes, or close authoritarian regimes, countries can be in the same categories, but very far from each other in these things. And we just modeled here 10 different dimensions. You see here that here you will find the multi-pyramid power network regimes belonging to the single pyramid power networks in the other place. Here you will see the limited nature of executive power, unconstrained nature of executive power, and the totalitarian power. When we see the next dimension, formality of the institutions, semi-formal institutions, informal institutions, this means that which are the dominant forms, even different type of institutions, what you have there. The characteristic of patronalism, the patronalism of rule in these countries, non-patronal one, informal or bureaucratic patronal one, and another division between the political parties, which is politicians' parties, cadres parties in the classic communist regimes and even the market exploiting dictatorship, and vassal parties in the patronal democracy and the patronal autocracy. The next dimension is that what is the role of the so-called leading party in quotation mark, yes, in a communist dictatorship or even market exploiting dictatorship. They are state parties. In patronal democracies, liberal democracies, conservative autocracies, they are governing parties, while in the patronal autocracy, they are transmission-bad parties. Now the next one, that what is the role of corruption in these countries, you know? In liberal democracies, even conservative autocracies, it's a system destroying. The corruption has a system destroying main feature. While in communist dictatorship, under control is a system lubricating, I would say, corruption. While in a partly in patronal democracy, but mostly in patronal autocracy. It's a system constituting corruption, when it's the basic decisive element of the system of a mafia. When we see the ideology, when we see that a liberal democracy is ideologically neutral, the state itself, the state power, while in a conservative autocracy and communist dictatorship is ideology driven, while here is ideology applying, which means that ideology applying, in the case of ideology applying countries, ideology has a functionality coherence, what they had to create, that what are the concrete needs, what to use with ideology. When I say about a regime that is ideology driven, it means that they are ready to pay even the prices to follow an ideology coherence when they are speaking about ideology. And the last one is the autonomy of civil societies. It's free, subjugated, and in a communist dictatorship is practically non-existent. And now, if we go back, and now I have to find the countries. Wait, hogy találom meg az országot? One moment. Oh yes, that's it. Thank you very much. Just the pictures. Let's, if I want to have, let's start now with Hungary. You know what is the route what they went in, and we started as it is going by the years. You can see down here the years. You see that what is the route what Hungary played, but it means that we try to create such a system, such a tool for analysis, that in a concrete time there is a coherence that where a country stands in a given time in this system of description, and you will see that in what time, what is the route, what is the trajectory of the given countries. And now, if we just switch of the years, yes, just to see that. Now let's see Poland. What happened with Poland? What is the road? What Poland what Poland went through? And now, if we just make just one single axis in this model, when we have the main type of analysis between democracy and dictatorship, then in such a model, one is simply an axis between liberal democracy and dictatorship. You see that Poland and Hungary are not far from each other in the traditional description of the so-called democracy and status of democracy in these countries. But if you take that other model, then you will say that they are very far from each other if you want to characterize the real nature of those autocratic attempts, what they try to go through. And now, if we just take out the roots from this model, one moment, excuse me. Yes, and now we will go through to the other dimensions. Then you see that Poland is still a competitive authoritarian regime. Hungary is much more now a hegemonic one. If we go to the next thing, in Poland still we have a multi-pyramid power network. In Hungary we have practically a single pyramid power network. In Poland the nature of the executive power is still limited. In Hungary it's unconstrained. If we have a look at the formal institutions, they are dominant by formal institutions. Anybody who has real power, they are not simply the member of the peace, but they are in leading, who has political power. They are member of the formal leading bodies of the peace of the Polish governing party. In Hungary, the dominant power is informal power. They have in Hungary, we do not have a separation of branches of power, but in an adopted political family, which is the form of the ruling elite in Hungary, none of the members can have different sources of power at the same time in their own hands. If somebody has a leading position in Hungary in the Fidesz as a political party, they are normally don't have leading position in the government. If an oligarch has a leading position or leading some important assets, let us say in the media, they do not have separately big assets in other parts of the economy. The only exception from this is Mr. Mészáros, who is a gas fitter, who was the classmate of Orbán Viktor, and it means that in his case there is no separation of power in that sense that he has a lot of enterprises in his formal ownership, a lot of media outlets in his formal ownership. He was for a long time the mayor of the village where Orbán grew up, of Felcsút, and practically managed the matters of the estate, Orbán estate in Felcsút. So in his case, you can't see this separation of total and consequent separation of branches or resources of power, but it means that this is him, Orbán. And if we are thinking about the level of, level of patronalism, these systems are the liberal democracy and conservative autocracy could be considered a non-patronal system, while the Orbán regime, the present Orbán regime, is a informal patronal system. In the case of the leading party, there is a politician's party, but in Orbán's case, it's a Vezos party, which means, for example, that even after 2002, they managed to change the party constitution in such a way that the president of the party, Orbán, as a single person, has the right, according to the party constitution, to select and to decide about the candidates to the Hungarian parliament, the candidates to be on the side of the Fidesz, the candidates to be mayors in any cities or villages. So practically, as one person, as a single person, he can decide about the fate of his clients. If we are thinking about the parties themselves, as I mentioned earlier, the PiS is still a governing party, even if it's centralized one, of course. But the Fidesz as a political party practically does not exist. It has no sense to speak about that. Practically, the Fidesz now, it has no programs. It does not make any decision, practical decision. All decisions are made personally by Orbán and such a way. While of course in the communist dictatorship and even in market exploiting dictatorship in China, you see a state party. The last one of the last distinctions is that if we follow the integration schemes of Polanyi and even make difference between bureaucratic resource redistributive systems like in a communist regime and relational market redistribution, where the power and ownership emerged. There is no power without ownership, there is no ownership without power. These are absolutely different. That of where you have still private property and competitive market, and even if you have spreading state property, it's clearly state property, while the private property is clearly private property. And this is in a conservative autocracy still can be the situation, while in Hungary we have a relational market where with the help of state coercion, and this is partly why we speak about mafia state in the case of Hungary, Russia, and Central Asian countries, Hungarian private owners are deprived from their properties with the help of state coercion, and new owners loyal to Fidesz, loyal to Orban, belonging to the adopted political family, can seize these properties. And this is why we say that while still in Poland, the corruption, of course, it occurs, but it's a system-destroying one, and Kaczynski itself, from this point of view, a totally Puritan man, I would say. Here in our system, the corruption is not a deviancy in a patronal autocracy, it's a system constituting element, the corruption itself, and the corruption, if you belong to the adopted political family, they do not want to exclude that you should be corrupt, but it's a precondition to belong to the adopted political family that you would be corrupt. Otherwise, you cannot be blackmailed, and you cannot be directed from above and blackmailed by the chief patron. The corruption, on the other hand, in a communist regime, for example, is a system lubricating corruption that in a planned economy, practically the economy could not work without corruption. But even the level of that corruption is controlled by the Communist Party. And if we see the ideological things, and as I mentioned already, that in a patronal autocracy, it's an ideology-applying regime. The different ideological panels has an functionality coherence, while liberal democracy and ideologically neutral, the state itself, it means that every participant can follow its ideological devotions as they want, and they compete with each other, while a conservative autocracy and a communist dictatorship, it's an ideology-driven regime. And the last slide is here now that the situation of the civil society in these countries, even in a patronal democracy, civil society is more or less free, while in a conservative autocracy, and especially a patronal autocracy, subjugated, and in a communist dictatorship, or even it's a question in market splitting dictatorship, it does not exist. These are what I was speaking about. These are idea types. So what I wanted to present here, that if we want to have a coherent analysis, then we tried with Balin and Modlovich together to create such a system where you can see a coherence in a certain point in this model. And some other countries, of course, they can be represented what they are doing in this model. I do not want to show too much as finishing now my presentation here. Well, that about the four trajectories. One is, let us say, what I show you is Estonia, and I try to put here the route what they went in. This was a primary trajectory. Now let's take another country, let us say Romania. Here you can see that there is a very delicate position for a patronal democracy, because it has always an attempt by certain political actors, patronal networks, getting into power to transform it into patronal autocracy. But the two major institutional obstacle of such an attempt is the proportionate election system and the divided executive power. And there is a fluctuation and a permanent move. And from a patronal democracy, you cannot transform itself into a liberal democracy if the democratic breakthrough is not accompanied by an anti-patronal breakthrough as well, anti-patronal change. And let's see a third model, for example, Kazakhstan, which which from a very short period of patronal democracy, they became a patronal autocracy, and this is the main model for other Central Asian countries, even not having patronal democracy in those countries like Uzbekistan and some others. And finally, here you will see China, where it went from a communist dictatorship, a communist dictatorship towards a market exploiting dictatorship. Now, in the time of Xi, it became again a harsher political regime. Well, thank you very much for your patience to watch this whole presentation, and I am very eager for your reactions and questions to answer. Thank you very much. For your patience to watch this whole presentation, and I am very eager for your reactions and questions to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you in turn. This is always the moment where one wishes one was in person for all the applause that I'm sure you would be hearing. Thanks for this literally layered presentation, and really illuminating. I don't work with these kinds of models, and I'm really impressed to see the payoff of going from 2 dimensions to 3. It really makes it's very persuasive how much can be gained by introducing this model. We already have a couple of questions, very interesting questions in the Q&A. I encourage other people to add their own, but I'm going to take the liberty of just asking 2 very brief follow-ups myself, just for clarification, to get us started. One is, you title your talk 2 autocratic attempts to overthrow liberal democracy. In other words, in your model, you're starting on the top left corner of the triangle in talking about Poland and Hungary. And I just want to know to what degree that's accepted wisdom or your conviction that both Hungary and Poland arrive at that top left-hand corner in the post-communist period before they go somewhere else. So in what sense were they really functioning liberal democracies at some point to start out with? And following up from that, my second question is, and that's also driven, of course, by an interest from watching what's happening here in the United States, is how much of the move away from liberal democracy is built into the workings of liberal democracy. So how legal, to put it one phrase, you didn't talk much about the legal framework, but if we pick out as a layer the legal system, how legal are the transformations out of liberal democracy? As somebody put it at an event we had here on Tuesday about the erosion of democracy in the United States, that I think it was my colleague Rob Mickey who said, the thing is that the people who are working, for example, to undermine access to the vote are working against democracy, but they're very good at democracy. So they're using democracy in order to undermine its functioning. So that's my question. To what degree is that part of the modeling and the thinking of moving out of that top left-hand corner through legal democratic means?
Yes, in our book, what we wrote with Balint model, which we deal with the question and with the problem of past dependency, and in spite of the fact that as a researchers we are in a lucky situation that all these countries were communist dictatorships before the regime changes, there are three main territories going from west to east where its past dependency has a real role. The past dependency is built on practically the historical degree of the separation the spheres of social action, the politics, the economy, and communal actions. To some extent, I would say that it more or less follows the historical borders of religion as well. That those countries in the former communist world, which belong to the Western Christianity, let it be Catholic or Protestant, there historically started already the separation of these spheres of social actions, and therefore it was a retreat from this position, the communist rule in these countries. The next territory is the countries of Orthodoxy. There, the separation historically was much less developed, and the third, the Islamic countries of Central Asia, practically it did not exist anyway. So therefore, after sweeping away the communist rule in these countries, these historical conditions started to live. Therefore, of course, it was much easier for those countries who belonged historically, now I'm simplifying this, of course, belong to this Western Christianity, to go from a communist dictatorship to a liberal democracy. The others, as for example, mainly the countries of beyond the former Soviet Union, belonging to the Orthodoxy, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, etc., they are much more patronal democracies, and they even did not reach the position of a classic liberal democracy, while countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, etc., they even did not reach the position of patronal democracies. Well, if you were a liberal democracy, there are two main exceptions from this, let us say, from this so-called in quotation marks rule. One is Georgia, which during Saakashvili, etc., they tried to go toward a liberal democracy from a patronal democracy, but there were some backlashes, etc., but it really an exception, especially if we consider the level of corruption in that countries, and it has some policy-specific reasons. Like the Saakashvili brought from the United States back a young team and was very aggressive in this transformation, etc. And the other exception in the other direction is Hungary, where we committed that mistake during the regime change, that the election system what we introduced was very disproportionate, and this made it possible to seize an unlimited power, a constitutional power, where practically with the help of which, if you had such an actor like Viktor Orban, they could destroy democracy. Well, when I was in the parliament and in the government, in the socialist Free Democrats government, when I belonged to the Free Democratic Party as a first time as a Minister of Education I was there from 96 to 98 in that government. At that time, the socialists and the Free Democrats, the two parties had 72%, so much more than two-thirds majority. But we immediately, mainly as a rule, as a policy of the Free Democrats, we tried to create a control over our power as well, and we raised, unfortunately, just temporarily, the changing to change the constitution, the necessity for that to 80% of the parliamentary members. But of course, next time Fidesz, after a collapse in 2010, they just use it. Even at that time, when we introduced this constraint on our power, Orban told us in opposition that we are totally crazy, Power is not for not for to be restricted, but it's for to be used, you know, and he is using. So this tragic situation that once one of the patronal networks, like Orban's patronal network, could gain the monopoly of political power, they have a real chance to consolidate that power. In our book with Balint Madlovic, we make a distinction when we are speaking about autocratic transformation, 3 stages: autocratic attempt, autocratic breakthrough, and autocratic consolidation. And in Hungary, the autocratic attempt of the Fidesz, they had already during their first government between 1998 and 2002, but they could not manage an autocratic breakthrough. They had the autocratic breakthrough in 2010, and from 2010 an autocratic consolidation. Now, what's going on in Poland, as a result that they do not have a constitutional majority of the PiS, they are in a permanent autocratic attempt without yet an autocratic breakthrough. But of course, a system can slowly erode if it lasts too long, you know, and it's a question that if we, excuse me, if we go back to, now I take it out and China, and go back to Poland and no, excuse me. Yes, Poland and Hungary. It can happen that within the EU there are constraints for creating a total conservative autocracy, and it can happen that Poland will try to go towards the Hungarian direction, trying to blackmail private ownership to take over it and to create a patron-client network, an informal structure of blackmailing instead of just a formal status where from state position, state ownership, they try to control bigger and bigger part of the society. So this was for the answer for your first question. What was the second? Because
I think you've started answering the second one. I'll just restate it, but move on to other questions. The other one was, to what degree liberal democracy contains the seeds of its own undoing? You know, how can liberal democracy be turned against itself, including its own legal mechanisms? Yes. To undo democracy, and what you see in those 2 countries in particular. That, I mean, I was thinking of the situation in Poland with the Supreme Court and the rearranging of the Supreme Court.
In Poland, it's under a permanent attack, you know, and of course it's another question that how other countries from the EU had the autocratic attempt in these countries. For example. A Bavarian enterprise which owned in Poland 20 out of the 26 regional newspapers, dailies, and about 500 websites, and a lot of radio stations. They sold it to the state oil company in Poland, which means they put it under control. I consider this a betrayal, you know, that practically they betrayed that country, you know. They are when the EU is speaking about the necessity of democratic rules, but at the same time, such a business serves autocratic attempts. In the case of Hungary, the question is that practically, while in Russia and Central Asia, mainly oil revenues, gas revenues, these provide the financial source of building an autocratic regime. In Hungary, the EU funds represent those sources with which an autocratic regime can be built out, you know, and used. And until now, the EU had no answer for this problem. And even it's a question that whether Germany wants to do it, while they have a lot of car assembly factories in Hungary, and they pay only 9% of the revenue as a tax revenue, etc., etc. So they are in a very privileged position in Hungary, the German auto industry.
Yeah, I think the European context, obviously, we could talk at length. That's really interesting. I'm going to try to get to some of these really interesting questions. And taking first Kristi Fehervaris, who I also want to thank publicly for making the connection to you and bringing us in contact. My colleague here at the University of Michigan in anthropology, but she's currently in Budapest, and she writes, "Thank you for this illuminating comparison. Could you speak to a comparison between PiS and Fidesz in terms of their use of religious Christian institutions, since you already brought up the role of religion?" She asks, is Fidesz Orban using religious institutions in new ways to forward its economic and political agenda, not just the ideological one? She's thinking of restitution of church property to undermine the opposition, as with the Theater Academy, or returning controls of schools to religious institutions as a way of privatizing education.
Yes, around 98, or even a little earlier, Fidesz has to face the problem that they do not have a national network, and since 92-93, they started their political move from a liberal position towards a nationalistic and position, and supporting the religious institutions. In this attempt, they were supported by the church, and they supported the church as well. Practically the first real network, nationwide network of the Fidesz became the church. This was an ideological turn of the Fidesz from liberal ideas towards, they thought that they are national liberals, then they thought that they are just nationalists and not liberals. At the end, that they are national. But what I said you about the functionality coherence of their ideology, that even they declare that they are Christians and support Christian principles. These principles are overwritten when, for example, they have to make deals with Azerbaijan. In this war, for example, between Azerbaijan and Armenia, they support the Muslim Azerbaijan against the Christian Armenia. In the case when they have good relations with China, of course, they do not mention that in China the Christian priests are attacked, pursued, etc., etc. In this case, it's not a problem for them, in spite of the fact that there is a ministerial commissioner whose task is to defend Christianity all over the world. But if they can make private businesses with such autocratic countries, then of course these principles do not count at all. And when, for example, they transform a large share of the Hungarian schools into church ownership, it means that they want to extract it, to withdraw it under democratic control, that any changes in politics or in the composition of the parliament should affect these schools again, and they try to concentrate most of the elite education in the hands of the religious schools in elementary school, and especially in secondary schools. But now there is a new move in higher education, that they create some new foundations, and the curatoria of which is nominated by the Fidesz and filled up with Fidesz politicians, and they put into the constitution that these curatoria cannot be changed only by the curatoria themselves. So practically, when they feel now that maybe in 2022 there is a possibility for the opposition to win, they distribute most of the state ownership and transfer it into either to private hands or into such such foundations which are led by their political nominees.
Thank you. I'll try to get to two more questions before we close. One is from Katrin Nikos, who thanks you for an excellent, clear, cogent presentation and asks, you referred to the elimination or ghettoization of spaces for freedom of expression. How does that impact the average individual in Hungary? Do they feel free to express their opinions without fear of repercussion? How about for academics such as yourself who speak out? Could there be some degree of backlash for you, at least in subtle ways?
Yes. During the communist times, we had a joke that we have freedom of speech, but what we have, that's it, freedom after speech. This is what we do not have. Now, in such an autocratic regime, there is another way of controlling the freedom of speech, namely, you have freedom of speech. The power does not control the content itself, they control the access. And this is what the outrage. So formally, you can tell whatever you want, but now there is only one TV station which is partly free in Hungary. There were until now one radio station which was deprived from its frequency last time, the Club Radio, and on the other hand, the state-owned media is transformed into a propaganda machinery, and now already all the county-level dailies are taken over by the Fidesz. And it had several steps. First, that their clients bought it with the help of the state when they got special resources for that they could manage this. And at the end, let us say a few years ago, all of these stooges just offered their media outlets to a foundation which was founded by one of the clients of Orban, and now a few hundred media outlets belongs to this foundation and is under the control of the Fidesz. And even they tried to boat up the distributing agencies as well. So now, until now, the post office, the state post enterprise, had an obligation to spread any advertisement, any newspapers, leaflets, etc. in the country. Now they abolished this obligation, which means that okay, you can print if you want, but you cannot you cannot distribute it in a simple way. You would have to organize a parallel organization for the distribution, of course, for which normally you do not have money. So this is like a situation that, of course, you can sing under the shower in your bathroom, but you cannot get onto the stage if you want to sing a song,
So in view of the time, I think we're going to have to leave it there, but I want to say two things. First of all, I want to thank you for making use of your freedom of speech to share it with us.
Yes.
Second, I want to note that in terms of access and distribution, this event has been recorded and will exist on the YouTube site of CRIS, if you can access YouTube.
Yes. Still can.
There you go. So we're trying to put a little dent into this wherever we can. And then to let our audience know that although this was the last of the CRIS noon lectures, next week on Thursday, April 22nd at noon, we are co-sponsoring an International Institute roundtable on coronavirus politics, the comparative politics and policy of the COVID-19 response. That's going to be moderated by the co-editors of a book on this topic, Scott Greer and Elizabeth King, who are also faculty associates in WCEE. And later on that same day, Thursday, April 22nd, we're very happy to be able to co-sponsor a webinar by the Center for Armenian Studies on the problems of genocide, permanent security, and the language of transgression. So that's a little bit of housekeeping and advertising for our own small center here, but the focus for today really should be on Balint Magyar's talk, which was really illuminating and a great pleasure to be able to listen to. I want to thank you again on behalf of the audience for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. Thank you.
Okay, I hope we'll be in touch.
Yes, I hope as well.
Bye-bye.